In this video, I'm going to talk about curating evaluation prompts, defining scoring criteria, and designing an LLM Judge prompt template. Designing simple, robust, effective evals is one of the most enjoyable experiences in ML, and it's a truly empowering and fascinating experience to take something squishy like language and build some structure around it and infrastructure around it to consistently kind of track performance around these very squishy things that make language so interesting. So I'm going to walk through my process for the initial steps I've taken for the TinyScaleLab project for these efforts. First, I'm going to do a quick recap because I have pivoted a bit from what I showed in the last video where I talked about eval targets and initial evaluation prompts. So I had established these eval targets that I think I'll still use for reference. These were taken from Figure 4 of the Tiny Stories paper based on hidden dimension and number of layers. And these are scores out of 10 that they used GPT-4 as the LLM Judge. So I still think I'm going to use this as reference, and I'm pretty excited to see whether or not I can get values close to these. The part where I have built off of, I wouldn't say I've deviated, but I think I've definitely built off of, is that in the last video I was talking about how I was going to use directly the evaluation prompts that are posted in the Tiny Stories dataset Hugging Face repo. And these are a set of 44 prompts that they used for evaluation in the paper. And as you'll see in this video, I think I have some pretty good reasons to deviate from this, and I'm pretty excited to see if it works. So, one prompt to score them all. Is that truly what I'm going to use? And the answer is no. But this is what I have seen before. I saw it in the Tiny Stories paper. I've seen it in the Tiny Hackathon. And basically, you have a prompt with a lot of instructions on what you're looking for in terms of creativity, grammar, plot, consistency, coherence, etc., whatever your scoring categories are. And then there's multiple points, and then you ask the LLM to give out of 5 points, give however many points you think, give an explanation. 3 is average, a 4 is better, a 1 is really incomplete. These are caps, these are things you should look for, etc., etc. And I'm definitely going to use most, if not all, of those ideas and techniques. But I kind of went on an interesting journey today, and I'm excited to share what I've learned. And I don't know if it's going to work. We'll see. But I have a feeling it might. So the most interesting prompts that I found in the Tiny Stories paper were the knowledge, reasoning, and in the context tracking section, 4.2. And it was the factual prompts and reasoning prompts in particular that I found to be the most interesting and fascinating, because those two, along with creativity, are immersion capabilities that we would expect larger models to exhibit, but are exhibited by smaller models. And they assessed these factual prompts and reasoning prompts different from the rest of the scores. And the way they did that was they did it more qualitatively, where they had success, failure, or partial success. And they have these tables where the first column is the prompt, and then the subsequent columns are different models, and they contain the model's completion. And then you look at, did the model fail? Did the model succeed? Was there partial success? So for example, Lily and Ben are having an argument. They're trying to decide between the park and the swimming pool. Ben says, I want to go to the park. Lily says, no, I want to go to the pool, right? That's the correct answer. Just for once, let's not make a bigoted choice. That's not wrong. That's not right. Somewhere in between. So we give it a partial success. So I found these to be really attractive and really interesting prompts because they were different than the general kind of usual story completion, once upon a time, So that was kind of my motivation for pursuing this kind of different set of prompts that we're going to see than the 44 that are in the eval prompts for the Tiny Stories paper. So the first thing I did is I took those 44 prompts and I gave it the definition, gave Claude the definition for factual prompts, reasoning prompts, and I asked it, if this prompt is good to measure a capability, write out one sentence for each capability saying what an appropriate response would include. And here's an example of what I provided. So I would give it a prompt. Once upon a time, there lived a bunny in a field. Her name was Lucy. Lucy loved to have feasts and parties with her bunny friends. One day, when Lucy was about to leave for a feast at a friend's house, she realized she's starting to feel sick. She was so weak she could, and then the model should generate the rest. So it provided, this model is good for evaluating reasoning, logical consequences of a bunny being sick and weak, showing cause and effect understanding appropriate for young children, and also consistency. Maintain Lucy's identity as a bunny who loves feasts, continue the established narrative about missing a friend's party due to illness, and keep consistent character traits throughout. And it's not strong enough for factual knowledge. And this is a general pattern I saw. I think almost every single prompt that I gave it, I think I maybe gave it a dozen or 2 dozen. Most of them it said reasoning and consistency, and all of them it said it's not strong for testing factual knowledge. So there was something about factual knowledge that I started to understand was very unique that these other prompts could not identify and could not target. However, I found that it was still fuzzy. If we go back here for reasoning consistency, establishing the narrative about missing a friend's party due to illness and logical consequences of a bunny being sick and weak, that seems fuzzy to me. That seems very similar. So I went back and I revised my prompt and I said, when evaluating whether a prompt is good for evaluating a given capability, only respond with strong evaluators. And in this case, when I gave it most of the prompts, it said it was testing consistency with its primary strength. And very few prompts were highlighted as strong testers of reasoning, and no prompts were highlighted as strong testers of factual knowledge. Again, a dozen or so plus prompts that I evaluated. I also did this differently. I gave it all 44 prompts and then asked it to identify which prompt number corresponded with which capability, reasoning, factual knowledge, and consistency. And again, I saw the same pattern, very few factual knowledge prompts and a high overlap between reasoning and consistency. So what are my main takeaways from this experiment? First, factual knowledge prompts are the most specific and therefore easiest to isolate, but it was also therefore hardest to find in my kind of 44 general prompts that were in the eval dataset. Context tracking prompts were a dime a dozen, and context tracking and consistency I'm using synonymously. I'm going to try to stick to context tracking moving forward because I think it's more straightforward and precise definition than consistency. And then reasoning is the hardest to isolate because context tracking and reasoning sometimes are very similar or hard to differentiate if the prompt is not strongly designed to evaluate reasoning. So this is where I started realizing that, okay, I'm not going to be able to use this set of 44 prompts to evaluate all skills equally. So I think what I should do is I should curate prompts specifically for each scoring category. So here was my goal. I want to generate prompts that either isolate, in the case of factual knowledge, reasoning, and context tracking, or elicit opportunities for the model to exhibit, in the case of plot and creativity, scoring categories. And so as I was going through the 44 prompts and Claude was classifying them and giving me appropriate responses for each one, I started to see a pattern where whenever I was flagging a prompt as a good candidate for creativity, I did so because it provided an opportunity to be creative without losing consistency or plot. And that was not always the case. So for example, this prompt, in my opinion, is not a good candidate for creativity because being creative would likely cause the model to lose its consistency with the prompt or use poor reasoning. So Jack asked his mom if he could ride the bike all the way to his grandmother's house. She agreed, but she said that he shouldn't ride too fast because it was raining and the path was wet. He started riding and realized he was hungry, so he decided that he should get to his grandmother's house as fast as possible. But then he remembered his mom's words. So in this case, I feel that if a model is too creative, it's going to lose consistency with the thing that we're really trying to test, is that we want the model to remember that the mother said that he shouldn't ride too fast because it was raining. That's not to say that it can't be creative even beyond that, but in terms of contrast, if we look at this other prompt, once upon a time, there was a tiger who liked to play the guitar. One day, a bunny heard the guitar from a distance, and I think that's a lot more fertile ground for creativity. There's a lot to play with, and it can be creative without losing consistency and reasoning because it already has a creative premise. There's a tiger who's playing a guitar, right? So that's already kind of an innovative, unexpected situation. So again, these are my initial thoughts, and this was certainly things I've given it thought to as I was working, analyzing these prompts and thinking about what would be a good response. So it's not without thought, but it's also not tested. Similar experience I had, similar conclusion for plot candidates. So when I flagged good candidates for plot, I thought that prompt provided a pretty strong opportunity or unique opportunity to resolve some kind of conflict or pursue an adventure, and that would really test the ability of a model to have a plot for that story. And not all prompts are well suited to exhibiting an interesting plot. So for example, this prompt, one day, Grandma was in the kitchen getting ready to prepare. She had the ingredients for a tasty dish. Grandma said to her granddaughter, "Are you going to help me make this meal?" Her granddaughter, Jenny, replied, "Yes, I will help you." Grandma and Jenny began to prepare the ingredients. Jenny was clumsy. She dropped, etc. So I don't think that has as much of an interesting proposition or premise to lead to a completion that would have a interesting plot in the completion without deviating too far. Obviously, we're looking for something logical as a response. So we want something where, she dropped the flour or she dropped the butter or whatever the situation is. Contrast that with this prompt. One day a girl walked into the living room and noticed something very strange. There was a huge cabinet standing in the corner. It looked very old and heavy. She walked over and tried to open it when suddenly, okay, this one is way more interesting. You have a very interesting premise and setting. You have this old and heavy cabinet. Maybe it's magical, maybe it's going to break, maybe something's going to pop out of it. There's a lot more opportunities to do something with this in a kind of typical plot arc where you have a beginning, middle, and end, and you have some conflict and resolution, or you have some adventure and discovery, or some kind of template for an interesting plot. So that was my kind of reasoning for this type of distinction for creativity and plot. And I'll also add, and this we'll see more concretely later on, that creativity and plot tend to go together. And so prompts that are good opportunities to exhibit good plot making capability, I found them also to be good opportunities to exhibit creative capabilities. So I kind of did a reset and I'm like, okay, let me go back to the prompts they have provided, the factual prompts and the reasoning prompts and the context tracking prompts. And especially I think factual and reasoning prompts are not in the set of 44. I don't remember if the context tracking ones are. But I took the left-hand column for these prompts, and I gave them to Claude, and I said, okay, look, like here are some prompts. Can you give me some additional ones, right? And at this point, I was shooting for about 25 prompts for each scoring category. So based on the factual knowledge ones that I was already going to use, I think there were 8 or 9 in the Tiny Stories paper in that figure. I think figure 9, Claude created additional prompts. So these are very simple, very straightforward. Do fish breathe air? Tom asked his father. Why does it rain? Lily asked her teacher. Em asked, how many legs does a spider have? So as you can see, like, these are very different from the context tracking, creativity, plot style of prompts where we're trying to get the model to write a story, where in this case, we're trying to get the model to exhibit knowledge about common sense, kind of facts or world knowledge. And then I did the same thing for reasoning. So I gave it all of the reasoning prompts that were in the paper, I think, figure 8 or figure 10, whatever the case may be. And I said, give me a few more. And so these were things like Sam was building a tower with blocks. He put a big block on top of a small block, and then the tower, hopefully, will collapse. Or Ollie was playing outside when dark clouds appeared in the sky. He heard a loud rumble. Ollie knew that, something about the rain coming or something like that. So these were, again, very different from factual knowledge, and these were very different from creativity and plot and context tracking. And so the more and more I was reading these and designing these with Claude, the more I was feeling better about my choice to kind of deviate from the 44 prompts in the Tiny Stories dataset repo and moving towards curating prompts for each scoring category. And again, I did the same thing for plot. I said, I want to give the language model an opportunity to generate a completion that involves an interesting story plot, right? So we're kind of, quote unquote, setting the model up for success. And if it's a capable model, it will capitalize on that setup and it'll deliver a interesting story plot. If it's not a capable model, even though it's set up for success, it'll fail to do so. So I didn't feel like this was necessarily like leading. I just wanted to give it a chance to exhibit some of these capabilities. So one morning, a small fish was swimming in the lake when it saw something shiny at the bottom. The fish swam down to look closer and found, whatever the case may be, it's treasure, it's a portal, etc. So I think there are a lot more interesting ways you can take this prompt, a lot more directions you can take it than do fish breathe air, Tom asked his father. And that's fine. Both are perfectly fine prompts. They're just meant for different purposes. Okay, so here's what my current eval prompt set includes. I have 25 unique prompts for reasoning, which are not used anywhere else. Not because they couldn't, but I just wanted to keep it simple and I wanted to create very specific kind of reasoning-friendly prompts. There's 25 unique prompts for factual knowledge. There's 25 prompts each for context tracking, plot, and creativity, and there's some overlap because context tracking was the most common. It's like everywhere, anytime you want to have a story. So that was not very hard to generate. So I generated more than 25 of those. Then I whittled it down to 25. And then for plot, I took some context tracking ones that were particularly well suited for a interesting plot. And then I generated some more to close the difference. And then I did the same thing for creativity. And then I have 25 prompts for grammar. Now, the grammar prompts are the most universal, right? The very fact that these prompts are in English and are in full sentences require there to be appropriate use of grammar. So what I've done here is I've sampled 5 prompts across the other 5 categories. So the 25 prompts for grammar are unique within themselves. So none of the 25 are duplicates of each other, but they are not unique across the full data set. And so I have 150 total prompts now. So I took those 44, fed them to Claude, had these kind of conversations about what rules I want to use for what categories, and almost quadrupled the number of prompts to 150. All right, so one prompt is not going to rule them all, and in the same way, one rubric is not going to rule them all. So I took grammar, creativity, and plot. These bullet points I've taken almost wholesale from the Tiny Hackathon competition evaluation prompt that I participated in. And for the factual knowledge and reasoning ones, I decided to keep it very simple because I found that as soon as I expanded the factual knowledge or reasoning criteria, scoring criteria, it started leaking into context tracking, right? So it was very difficult to come up with different reasoning and factual knowledge criteria for scoring without them having this kind of blurry overlap with context tracking. So at the risk of, maybe being too simplistic, for factual knowledge, there's only one criteria. Completion contains only correct factual information relevant to the prompt. For reasoning, there's only one criteria. Completion demonstrates correct logical reasoning relevant to the prompt. And you could argue that the relevant to the prompt is still a form of context tracking, but I think at some point you have to incorporate this idea that something can be factual, but it could be irrelevant, and something could be well reasoned, but it could be irrelevant to the premise of the story or the sentence. And one thing you'll notice is that grammar has 5 criteria, creativity has 4, plot has 4, factual knowledge and reasoning have 1, and context tracking has 3. This was not intentional, but what's intentional is that I'm not forcing the same number of criteria for each scoring category, which, the major consequence of that is I can't use raw scores to compare, right? So grammar is going to be out of 5, creativity is going to be out of 4, plot's going to be out of 4, factual knowledge and reasoning are going to be out of 1, context tracking is going to be out of 3. So when I do my analyses, I'll have to, triple check that I'm normalizing these scores before I compare them. So how am I scoring these? Let's see if I have, let's go back to this one. So I'm basically just quantifying the type of qualitative scoring that they did for these factual reasoning and context tracking prompts in the paper, where you have success, partial success, and failure. So what I'm doing is that for each of the criteria under the scoring category, the model should score a 0 for that criteria if the judge should score a 0 for that criteria if the model does not exhibit that characteristic in the completion. It should score 0.5 if it partially or somewhat exhibits it, and it should score 1.0 if it fully exhibits it. So we'll look at an example shortly. But that's why for grammar, the scores can be 0 to 5, creativity 0 to 4, plot 0 to 4, factual knowledge and reasoning 0 to 1, and context tracking 0 to 3. So I do feel like this is taking a risk, and I have a feeling it's going to come back to bite me later on. But at least for now, I want to keep things simple, and more important than simple, I want to keep things certain. Like when I'm manually evaluating these model generations, I want to keep things as certain and clear signal. So when I'm evaluating reasoning, I don't spend, 10 minutes trying to figure out whether my 5 categories are actually fitting the completion. Okay, so I think the moment that at least I was certainly waiting for throughout this process was, okay, this is great. I have my eval prompts, I have my scoring criteria, and I have my scoring methodology of 0, 0.5, and 1.0. Let's make the LLM Judge prompt template. And so the consistent pattern that we've seen throughout this process is that there's curated prompts for each scoring category. There's curated rubrics for each scoring category. So it naturally follows, or at least I think it naturally follows, that there would be a curated prompt for the LLM Judge for each category. So I'm not going to have the judge score all 6 categories with one prompt. I'm going to send one prompt for each of the 6 categories. So in total, anytime I want to evaluate a model, it'll be evaluated on 25 prompts for grammar, for context tracking, reasoning, factual knowledge, creativity, and plot. And when the LLM Judge is evaluating each one, it's not going to be evaluating anything else. So let me switch out of this screen and let's go here. So I have started a TinyScaleLab repo that I'll put in the video description. There's not much there right now. I have some acknowledgments, obviously, for the 2 research papers. I have links to where I'm sharing information and process. And then I have the eval rubrics that we just saw. And then we have the LLM Judge prompt template. So this was something, again, I collaborated with Claude on. I had this initial prompt, and it greatly improved it. So I'm using these like XML style tags because I've read that that's effective for LLMs. And we have the instruction, which is pretty generic. You are an expert evaluator for tiny language models trained on children's stories. Your task is to score the given model completion, generated using the provided prompt using the rubric below. Provide a detailed estimate or assessment followed by a final total score. So that's the instruction. Then for the rubric, we start by giving the criteria. So there's, for grammar, there's 5. For reasoning, there's going to be 1. So this is where I will list out the criteria for each criteria for the scoring category. And then the scoring scale is going to be consistent. So this is going to be the same. Criterion is fully satisfied. That's the level where it's 1.0 is the score. Criterion is partially satisfied is the 0.5 score, and criterion is not satisfied is the 0.0. And then we go into scoring instructions. So for each criterion, assign a score of 1.0, 0.5, or 0.0, depending based on how well the completion satisfies that criterion. The final score is the sum of all criterion scores. So that ends the rubric. Then there's the generation prompt. There's the completion. And then there's the response format where I'm saying provide your assessment of each criterion with specific examples from the text. Then calculate the final score, sum of all criterion scores. Format your response as, so within this evaluation, give me the criterion score, give me the explanation, do that for all the criterion or all the criteria, and then give me a final score, and then close the evaluation, close the response format, and then here we're closing our instruction prompt. So at first glance, I thought that was pretty good. It certainly made a lot of sense. And then I tried it out on Claude.ai. I tried it out with Claude Haiku 3.5. And I gave it, I think, 2 prompts, it wasn't anything exhaustive. I just wanted to do a quick sanity check, like, is this even going to work? And I was surprised it worked really well. This was the weaker model. So this was, I think, grammar. So I think it makes sense that this was, 3.5 out of 5. So that's 70%. Probably too lenient. So I'll have to revisit that for sure. So I might have to add some guardrails on, what is the difference between partially satisfied and did not satisfy. But when I gave it a larger models evaluation, it gave me 5 out of 5, which I generally agreed with. So I'm like, okay, it's definitely giving a better score for the better model. I think both scores are a bit inflated, but that's something I can refine down the road. So far, initial test, thumbs up. I think this is at least worth pursuing. If not, I think it'll work well. So next steps. So the main next step for me is to now generate 150 completions for the 150 prompts in total. So total completions of 150. And then I want to go through, follow my own rubric, and for each criteria in each scoring category, I want to give a score of 0, 0.5, or 1.0 to each model's response. So I have 3 models, and I have 150 prompts, so it'll be a grading of 450 prompts. So it's not nothing, but it could be worse. And to make my life easier, this is a sketch that I did in Google Slide, but I'm going to get Claude to help me to whip up a relatively quick data evaluator. So I have a CSV with my prompts and my completions for each model. I have a CSV where I have my scoring categories and I have my criterion. And then I know that for each criteria, I have to have 0.0, 0.5, or 1.0. And then I want it to score and show me the total, so I have a good rough sense of what it is. And then I want it to store, for each criterion, I want it to store the score that I give it for this prompt, for this completion, for this model. So this is something I started working on today. I was vibe coding it, and it was very frustrating. And I'm not going to vibe code anymore on this project. I'm going to still use Claude, but I do want to build this up from scratch using fast HTML. It should be relatively straightforward, but those are famous last words. But yeah, this is the next step that I'm going to be working on. So I do expect this to take at least a couple days to build. For if I'm lucky, maybe one day, and then To actually do the evaluations, that'll probably take another couple days because I got to get through 450 of these, and it's a decent amount of text to read and make decisions on, and I'll probably have to do a second pass on some of the earlier ones once I get better at scoring. So that's the next step. The next video is most likely going to be a look at your data type of video. This video was already kind of in that vein. So I hope you continue watching this journey, and I'm excited to share more. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.